Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your host, Mr. Sydney Brownwood.
Good evening and welcome to the latest Lardy Oddcast. And once again, it's Sydney Roundwood here as your host, being joined in the studio by the holograms of Nick Skinner and Richard Clark, the R2-D2 and C3PO of wargaming, beaming across time and space to be with us. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Beep, beep. Hello, Sydney.
It's great to see you both, although I am feeling a little bit melancholy today.
Oh, what's wrong, Sid?
I know, because I've realised that today we should normally, on the 18th of April 2020, have been somewhere rather special, standing by the bins and or the exit with a little bit of severe backache from carrying numerous boxes of heavy rules and those strange cage things that we put TooFatLardies products on. Salute.
We could have had a nice breakfast, Sid.
Oh, not your bloody breakfast after last year. Well, you see, you've skived off 2 years running now, haven't you?
Yeah. I have to say, I was a bit worried that I might end up at the XL Centre anyway. I thought how ironic that would be.
Yes, it would be ironic. And I could just see us there in adjacent hospital beds next to the bins at the back. But fortunately,
breakfast would have been as good.
Fortunately, we've avoided that.
We have. But yes, it would have been great to be at Salute. So instead of that, we're stuck at home with a cup of tea.
Well, wipe away those tears, gentlemen. And tell me, what have you been up to since we last chatted on the Oddcast?
Well,
you go first. I always go first, so you can lead us off for once.
Okay. Well, funnily enough, we went to a war game show.
We did.
We did, but it wasn't a real life war game show, mate. Like Salute, it was Pat McCon. Pat McCon was an Irish dustbinman who I used to drink with many years ago, but it wasn't him that we were seeing. This was Paint All the Minis online convention. And it was an online convention using Discord. So we went there and we did some questions and answers sessions, and we did some more questions and answers sessions, and we had a nice time generally chatting to people. And I thought it was a really interesting format. Again, like with most war game shows, I was kind of tied to our little booth area because that's what we're there for. And there were lots of things going on. I was thinking, cool, I'd really like to have had the opportunity to go and see that. And that, as happens in reality, I never did. But it was nice to be able to interact with people. And then there was a real feeling that whilst I was sat here on my computer, it did feel like the people that we were having a Q&A session with were all in the same room, which was a bit surreal because they weren't. But it was great to reach out and make contact with people. And there were guys there from the United States of America and all over the globe. And it was really positive to be able to just have a chat with them verbally because there was a voice channel there. And a good friend of ours, Jonathan Youngling in Pennsylvania, made the point that, you know, this is better than a normal show in some ways. You know, he would never get an opportunity to come to Salute. And it's great to have an opportunity to chat among the Lard community, which we did. So there was some really positive stuff about it. And I did think there's opportunities here to do all sorts of things. You know, it might be really interesting to have, you know, do a kind of online wargaming history thing. You know, have an hour, 40 minutes or 40-minute lecture on how to take a wargame scenario, how to develop a wargame scenario, how to take a historical event, how to go through the research, how to present the maps and so on and so forth, or how to build a pint-sized campaign. It would be a potential there to do all sorts of things that might be maybe even better than a wargame show, because the thing, of course, we couldn't do was play wargames, which is what so many people go to conventions and shows to do. But there are alternatives that are kind of churning around in my mind. So it was a really interesting experience, Nick.
Well, yes, it was interesting. It was quite enlightening, and as you say, it opens some interesting avenues of thought for how the hobby can do more things online, particularly during this period of lockdown. But some guys were playing, I think, games, through the power of the internet during that convention. It was a 2-day event.
Yeah.
And as Richard said, yeah, it was a really intriguing way to interact, and I'm sure we're going to see more of it, not just because of lockdown, but because it is a way of making the world smaller.
Yeah, and also it's a way of keeping yourself sane when we are all, trapped away at home, and those nearest and dearest are driving us up a bleeding wall. So it's good to have a little bit of an opportunity to escape from reality.
Well, the coronavirus games has been featuring large in our house. We've been playing this league table of games, and we played. What was one we played most recently? We played Risk, and I'm disappointed to report that I didn't win at Risk. No, I didn't win it. I came very, very close to winning, and then everybody ganged up on me. And then they beat me down, so I felt a bit like Hitler. I was doing really, really well. I was extending my empire to the far reaches of the globe, and then everybody says, "You can't do that. That's a bit of a rotter." So they all ganged up on me, and I think in the end, my son ended up winning that. And we're going to have to play it again, I think, because it was covered in so much controversy at the end that we'll probably have to fight it again. But tomorrow we're going to be playing What a Tanker. My missus is going to be playing What a Tanker tomorrow.
Do you think
Stay tuned.
Do you think at the end of it she'll ask you to sign her copy?
I might give her a Panzer II, and I have a pattern or something.
Excellent. Well, that sounds fun. I did say to my wife and daughters, Nicholas and his family are running this great thing where they play a game and every couple of nights or whatever, and they said, "Bugger off, we're not playing stupid games with you." So I didn't have quite the same success. However, I do have 70 gallons of beer here, so I don't need that company anymore.
Well, I'm pleased to report that I won the Star Wars trivia game as well. So I've now got 2 points on the leaderboard, but I'm hoping that What a Tanker will move me into equal first place with 3 points.
Well, we took a leaf out of your book, Nicholas, and we're doing similar. We're doing Britannia tonight. We're forging an island destiny on blood and iron, as it says on the box lid. So all 4 of us are doing something similar to you. But we've been playing Settlers of Catan. That's been a long-running favourite.
We've done that one, yeah. I lost that one too.
We played Pandemic, which is quite strange because we are obviously in a pandemic. But the kids wanted to play that.
That's tasteful.
And we've played a number of other things. But one of the things I've really enjoyed over the last 2 weeks was the club painting evenings, which I know both of you were participating as well. So we had 11 people, I think, at one point online on Zoom. All the people from the TooFatLardies, St Albans Wargames Club. And we were all just painting and chatting for really about almost 3.5 hours, I think it was on Tuesday. I kind of lost track by the end.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are finding lockdown very productive when it comes to painting. Personally, it hasn't been for me, but I'll see lots of people making great progress.
Yeah, I'm treating it as an opportunity to catch up on stuff that I've been meaning to do for years and have never got round to doing. And I am getting loads done. I mean, I've just got a Dacian army through the post. I'm just in the process of painting up a load of Spanish figures who could either be allies of Caesar or they could be, taking part in the war with Carthage. So there's positives to be taken from it. It's a pretty bad situation all round, but from a personal point of view, I just think, well, why not seize the opportunity? For example, on Tuesday night painting night, when everybody was painting, lovely figures and whatever, I finished off 3 loads of fences that I've had knocking around the shed in various states of half completion. And I thought, no, I'm just going to start working through all this stuff that's been started and never finished and just get it all done. And that's been really positive for me. And of course, at the end of it, I end up with a load of extra terrain that I never had before.
I think that's been one of the real things, Rich, that I've noticed, and I think you've noticed as well when we've talked, Nick, is that being in forced isolation has given us the chance to introduce aspects of warfare and wargaming that we don't normally get to do. You wouldn't normally have spent 2 or 3 hours doing fencing, maybe. And also, I think on your Discord games, on your Kriegspielen, looking at you, Nick, on this one, you've possibly been looking at aspects of warfare that you might not wargame normally in tabletop gaming. And I think, Rich, you're going to add in as well in respect of some of the games you've been playing, focusing on things like logistics and staff planning.
Yeah,
well, yeah, that's right. I think last time we spoke about the recce game that we'd run, but since then I was lucky enough to be invited as an observer on a Discord war game that Jay Arnold was running in the States, which was more of a classic map-based ACW Kriegspiel, which is really interesting to see the guys go through that, and really interesting to watch as an observer, where you can just go around the various channels and just appear by magic if you want to. I purposely didn't stick my big fat nose in, but it was, too much, but it was just interesting to see how the guys worked. And of course, most recently we've completed a pretty mega action set in 1918, which Richard took the chair for, and that gave a totally different challenge. Rich, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I wanted to run a game based around the situation at the end of the German Kaiserschlacht, where the Germans had run out of steam, pretty much, and the Allies were then in a situation where they were planning their offensive. So this is the run-up to the Battle of Amiens, which then really started the 100 Days campaign, which knocked Germany out of the war. And one of the things I wanted to examine there was the importance of the logistics in the First World War, and also the importance of logistics in planning in warfare generally, and the relationship between generals and staff officers. So some people were playing generals, some people were playing staff officers, and the briefings they had were very, very different. So the generals were looking at the map and planning big sweeping movements, and I want these troops to move there, and I want these troops to do this, and I want this to happen here. Whereas the staff officers were attempting to introduce the concept of reality. This can only happen if we have got the supplies in place to allow these, even relatively small attacks to take place. So it was an opportunity to examine things, as you rightly say, Sid, that we don't normally get a chance to have a look at on the traditional war games table. And what was interesting was that the British were taking an awful long time to get a plan agreed. You had the Canadians and Australians under Monash and Curry tasked with leading the planning on this, and they kept submitting their plans to the British Commander-in-Chief, and he wasn't happy with aspects of it, and he threw the plans back to them twice. Well, in the interim, the Germans, who'd been very careful to try and build up some kind of reserve with their supplies, were being very, very frugal in the way they spent it, decided that they would have one last attempt to grab Amiens, because Amiens at that point in time was a colossal supply dump. And the German original plan had been to capture Amiens and use those supplies to push onto the coast and to divide the British forces away from the French forces, thereby obliging the French to sue for peace. So the German players decided they were going to have one last go at this, and they really just cobbled together enough supplies to have one big push lasting for about 24 hours. And they pretty much got to the gates of Amiens. In the end, it was a British division that had routed, and its officers got it to rally just enough to hold the causeway going into Amiens that saved the day. And a Royal Naval Division that the whole brigade had collapsed. The whole corps had pretty much collapsed. The corps commander had gone into the bag, captured with a pistol in hand, trying to rally his men in the Bois de Blangy. And the division commander there made his own decision, and that turned the tide. A really, really interesting and informative game, but it just allowed players to have a look at different aspects of warfare that we don't tend to see on the tabletop. And that game ran for about 3.5 weeks, which, in a lockdown situation is quite nice to have something to keep you occupied for, a lengthy period of time. Nick, you're looking at running another one, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm kicking one off. So I think one of the things that can be difficult on Discord sometimes, if you're having a live narrative game, can be time zones. But I'm running just kicked off a small one now, which is fairly Hornblower-esque in its narrative. It's set in the Napoleonic naval, with players taking on the role of ship's captains and their first lieutenants, and a few other characters around the edge. But I'm trying to keep that actually within the one time zone at the moment, because I think that's helpful to the progress of the game. However, I realise that restricts obviously what people can get involved in at a time when actually I want to broaden inclusion and be more and get more people in from different time zones. So I see this very much as a kind of short measure, and I think that once the game is established, it's one of those ones that could open its doors to other players.
Yeah, well, I mean, we had about 23 players in the Amiens game, so it's it's good to be able to get people involved.
That's fantastic. And
I think the reason I've made that actually is for my own health, in terms of my own input and my own ability to be online at absurd times at the moment.
I think it really does help to be in the same time zone. I did a online Twitter game which was run by Mark Backhouse, who is from the WSS podcast, and Mark organised about 6 people, and we did a small campaign just on Twitter over 2 nights, so really only about 4 hours. Based around the attack on the Isle of Wight by the French in the 1470s, and that was a big success. But it was very manageable. It was quite small number of people, small geographical extent, fairly contained campaign, and that worked really well. I mean, your Amiens campaign sounds fantastic, but yeah, as we know from Core Blimey and other sort of games, those the logistic aspects of the First World tend to swamp the game and mean that it can be an engrossing environment for players to be in. But it doesn't need to be huge, does it? I mean, the Discord games, the Twitter games can be really quite small and quite manageable.
Yeah, no, I mean, to be honest with you, 23 players, it turned into a full-time job. And unfortunately, it was a full-time unpaid job, so that's not really the ideal outcome.
Yeah, I am nervous with the game that I've just started up about what it might grow into. But then again, part of me absolutely loves it when it grows into something like that. So it's, it's a balance, isn't it? It's very difficult to say. People say, what investment of time do I need? What do you need from me as a player? Well, it's really hard to answer that question, because if they could be online all day, every day, then the game would let them do that. And of course, at the end of it, the other side of that is you as the umpire tend to be therefore around whenever they are. So while you want people to engage with the game, if it all goes ballistic, then it kind of consumes your whole life.
It does, which sometimes is great. Like when you're retired and sat on a beach in the Caribbean with a pina colada in one hand and an iPad in the other, running the game. But when you're trying to run a business, and it really does get in the way, and I found my productivity literally go through the floor. But
yes, I think if you can have access from debtor's prison, I'll be all right.
Well, never mind accessing prisons or pina coladas, because I understand that a little bird told me we've got a very special day coming this week. Nick, whether in debtor's prison or on the beach in Barbados, I believe it's your memorable day of the year. It's your birthday.
It's my birthday. It's my birthday tomorrow. I was looking forward to this weekend. I had a great weekend lined up. We had a good event lined up for yesterday. Rich and I were going to go to, which would have been great fun. And then today we would have been at Salute, which would have been hard work but rewarding, and nice to connect with people. And then Sunday was going to be my birthday, so I could top it all by telling the family and the wife that I'm going to do what I want all day. And now some of that's been taken away from me. We're all going to be in lockdown, but it's a bit of a hermit's charter, isn't it, being locked down? So I'll be enjoying myself with my family, but not sharing my presents and cake with anybody.
So now you had an interesting question presented to you when you're running one of your Q&A sessions at PatMacon. And I think from what Rich mentioned that you both were asked about solo gaming. And I guess that's something that a lot of us are considering as the lockdown period for coronavirus extends into the distance. So one of the things I wanted to do today was to talk about solo gaming. Now, Rich, I know you do some solo gaming when you're testing the TooFatLardies rules. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, obviously, when developing a set of rules, you want to create situations on the tabletop where you're attempting to see what works, what doesn't work. You're attempting to create situations that you haven't really thought about. But to be honest with you, that's a bit like combining an engine on, tuning an engine on a car with having a drive in the countryside. The stuff I'm doing on the table tends to be more tuning the engine than actually playing a game, or has been. I did used to do solo game when I was at school. I was very much didn't really know anybody who was into the hobby, and I solo gamed from when I first discovered wargaming when I was 11 until I discovered the club when I was about 18, which is still the same club that we go to. So it's something that I have had experience of, but an awful long time ago. As it is, I'm about to start on the next faction for Infamy, testing some of the stuff out on that, which is the Slave Rebellion. And that's going to be done solo, obviously, because of the circumstances we're in. So it's a good time to try and get some ideas.
Well, as we're a bit rusty on the subject of solo wargaming, we thought we'd try to ask an expert. So joining us now is a great friend of Lard who spent 25 years solo gaming, and he's got some interesting and really original thoughts on it. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome all the way from the Scottish borders, it's Charlie! Charlie, welcome to the virtual studio. Thanks for joining us here on the metaphorical couch of contemplation. So Charlie, you spent a long time playing solo games. So was that through choice? What's going on there?
Did you have no friends?
I suspect that may be the case, yeah. I'm not too sure, but I'd like to think it was force of circumstances. I grew up...
You had no friends, then that's what you're saying?
Yeah. I grew up in sort of out of the way places, you know, on a farm in the countryside, and I mean, to be honest, I gamed at school. I had a good mate there whose father was a war gamer, and we gamed there, and it was really, I think, when I left school and was working on farms in out of the way places where there wasn't a club or anything particular to go to. I got into it. I suspect there was also at that stage a little bit of an element of trying to get a girlfriend, and it perhaps wasn't the coolest thing to be seen doing, as I felt at the time. Yeah, so that's been my life, you know. And as things have gone on, we sort of got into setting up a fledgling business, young family, and it never quite. It never appealed to be trekking to a club, you know, over an hour away or whatever, while all that was going on in life. But things have changed more recently. But I spent a good long time where my gaming, I absolutely loved it, but it filled in around the edges of the other things that were going on in life.
Okay. And so 25 years of solo gaming, how have you changed what you've done over that time as a solo wargamer? I mean, I think you're talking to three guys who haven't really done a lot of solo wargaming kind of ever. So 25 years is quite some experience of doing it. So how has it developed and evolved, and which of the different avenues have you gone through or tried?
Well, I've tried no end of things. I started off simply playing games against myself, as it were, which was fun. I was playing games. I was pushing around model ships, toy soldiers, whatever, and playing games, and that was fun. But then, as that went on, I craved a little more of a challenge, perhaps, and that was when I got into. I remember finding the programmed war game scenarios by Charles Grant, and whilst it's quite, you look at it now and think. It's quite prescriptive, but that at the time was exactly what I wanted. I want somebody to tell me how to set up the forces, how to come up with a scenario. That was brilliant at the time. As time's gone on, I've become much more realize it's probably a little bit more about the rules that you're using for a game, and the more there are rule sets that can, if you've got variable movement, for instance, that makes a big difference to things. It's nowhere near as predictable as simply by that. If you've got variable activation, you've got inbuilt unpredictability, which makes it a much more interesting, exciting, challenging experience when you're making those decisions for each side. That's even without sort of trying to add in things where you surprise yourself and what have you. So it's gone full circle, and I'm much more comfortable nowadays just it being a bit more on the fly, nothing too prescriptive, just come up with some different ideas, maybe different deployment, maybe variable forces that I might actually be facing. If I want to take the side of one side and be challenged by the game, then I do that sort of thing. There are times when I'm quite happy just to play both sides, and I'd sort of have two methods, I think, as to where it's got nowadays. There's one which is, well, I call it the voyeur, and that is where you are in the position of an observer or a reporter, simply watching the game unfold before you, and that can be really enjoyable. But again, it all comes down to the rules that you're using. And if the rules are a bit dry and formulaic, it's all a bit predictable, not particularly interesting. Whereas if there's a bit more friction in there, inevitably it's more stimulating, and you can watch the sort of narrative build as the game unfolds before you. That's really interesting. And I still do that sometimes, particularly if I'm trying out scenarios for a game I might nowadays want to run for other people. But the other one, which is the thrill seeker, I call this, which is more when I want to be challenged by the game. I want the game to I want to take one side and actually try and beat the other side, but also the other side to be in a position to beat me, which maybe isn't that difficult based on my skills. But for that, it takes a little bit more preparation. There are props available. One that I came across a long time ago was the platoon forward supplement for, I think originally for troops, weapons and tactics of your own, which was by Joe Legan, I think, or Joe Legan. And that had some great material in it that really probably is a lot of the basis of how I now drive a game if I'm wanting this command challenge of taking one side. So for that, I might, if I was playing a game of sharp practice, I would write down on some index cards the subunits of a particular force. So there might be two groups of line infantry with a level 2 leader on one card, and then a group of 6 skirmishers with a level 1 on another, and a couple of blanks thrown in there and a few other things. I'd have maybe 3 different deployment points, and I'd be dicing for those. When I would pick a card as if the card comes up that, well, I use the blank card in the sharp practice deck. Sorry, I'm not explaining this very well. I've got a pile of index cards with various different forces on. I've got the sharp practice deck, which I've included the blank card. The blank card is serving as the, if you like, the special event, the reinforcement card for the enemy. When that card comes up, I'll pick an index card randomly. That'll tell me what force is coming on the table. I'll then dice for which of the deployment points it might be coming on at, and that, you know, you can tweak that. It could be more likely to be certain places, less likely in others. To have any number of deployment points if you really want the challenge. And then that brings me that unpredictability. So I can immediately be surprised by the enemy force or deployment and have imperfect knowledge of that. Going on from that, once that force is on the table, if I haven't already, if it isn't perhaps part of a campaign or something I've done a bit more prep with, I'll roll for the kind of attitude, if you like, or characteristics of that leader. And that can be as simple as it being a cautious leader, a steady leader, or a bold leader, or maybe even a rash leader. And it's not hugely prescriptive, but it just influences what that leader might do in any given circumstance. And I don't get too bent out of shape over whether it's exactly right. And if it's a bit of a 50-50 call, I might roll a dice. But it really just gives me a broad kind of outlook as to how that leader might behave. And to be honest, that used with the right rules, which, you know, for sharp practice has variable movement, which I think is another key thing. And obviously that card-driven mechanic helps enormously to create that unpredictability and friction. that has been more than enough for me to regularly be beaten by my imaginary opponent. Now, that may just reflect on my own abilities, but no, it's given me some really challenging and really interesting games, and also the ability to play the same game or the same table layout over and over.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. So I'm just trying to clarify this in my mind. So you would potentially know, let's say, let's go nice and vanilla, Peninsular War. You would know that you've got 3 groups of British Redcoat Line and 2 groups of 95th Rifles and 1 group of Spanish guerrillas, let's say. You'd know you had that, but your opponent, you wouldn't know what he had at all. You would just have the index cards. Would that be right? Or would...
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I might have given them a core, so I know that there will be, say, 3 groups of line.
Right.
I don't know what else is coming and where.
Right. That would make sense. So you'd get a core force, and then when the blank card comes out, you pull an index card. Yeah. Right. Okay, Nick.
That's really quite interesting, isn't it? Because actually it makes it even more unpredictable and uncertain what you're fighting against possibly than it does if you're playing against an opponent, when you normally know what your opponent has got because you've got the 2 sets of troops laid out on the table. But if you're picking from your, you know, if you're playing in your own house, presumably you've got all your toys available to you, you could potentially be deploying a force that's from your entire, you know, cabinet. It's a very, you could have lots of variety facing you. It's interesting, that.
And I think you raise a good point there, because you know, when we think about solo gaming, there's a tendency for us to think, here right up high as a shining pinnacle is a game with other people, and here right down at the bottom is this very second or third class alternative of solo gaming. But you raise a good point there, Nick. You're in your own house, or presumably, unless you like to burgle other people's houses and put games on there, you're in your own house, so you can wheel out any of the forces you've got, any of the troops you've got. So in a way, you couldn't do that on a club night, could you? Particularly unless you took a huge random selection of figures with you. So there are some advantages to solo gaming that mean it isn't inferior. It's just an alternative. It's something different. There are pros and there are cons. Do you see any other particular pros or cons, Charlie, or anybody else for that matter?
It's certainly, the nice thing about it for me when I was very busy in life was that it can really fit around. I'm not committed to Thursday night's club night. I need to find 3 hours, 4, 5 hours, whatever, for that night. It can be an hour one evening and 3 hours 2 evenings later, because that's when you've got some time again, that sort of thing. So it's very flexible. And I think it's also very flexible in terms of what you've just been talking about. You know, you can twist the narrative if you want to change things or try something. There's not somebody else there who potentially isn't on board with what you want to try and do. You think, oh, well, this game's going a bit pear-shaped. Well, there's going to be a big reinforcement for the other side and try and square things up and make it go a bit longer or whatever. So there's a lot more flexibility in that sense.
And equally, I guess, when you draw that card and you think, well, look, this is going really well, and if the enemy come on with another 3 units of cavalry or something, it's going to completely screw the game up, you can kind of ignore that, can you? Or would you? I don't know.
Yeah.
Or maybe that just creates a different challenge.
Yeah, you can. What I find, what I tend to do is not do what I've just described, which is to sort of try and balance a game up if it's going one way. I just sort of build it into my narrative of the campaign, which isn't an exhaustive bookkeeping exercise by any means. It's merely a thing that links one battle to the next. And you think, well, in that one, we got completely outnumbered, so we retreated, and we're going to have another go another day or whatever.
And do you tend to play them as campaigns, Charlie?
I do, but very loosely. Very loosely. I have great intentions of using the likes of Dawns and Departures and at the sharp end for doing, if you like, a little bit more formal campaign, albeit still not heavy duty in the sense of number crunching and what have you. But most of what I've tended to do has been fairly loose, a narrative. You know, we got pushed back here, so now we've got to go there, or so-and-so got captured, so we've got to go and rescue them, that sort of thing.
Okay, I like the idea of that.
One of the things which really struck me in describing what you're doing, Charlie, is that a little also seems to go quite a long way. I mean, the tweaks that you're making would be familiar to anyone, as you have, as we all have, put on games at shows and games days. But what you're doing in a solo context, you're doing something very focused, quite targeted, but it's not a huge amount of difference to what you're doing already. And a little does seem to make a real difference to those games in a really interesting way.
Yes, yeah, I would agree. I think that's the key. I wrote down what I thought were the key things that have made solo games really fun for me. And one is a good scenario. That's true of any game, but in a solo context, once I realised and I got access to decent scenarios, or possibly started coming up with some of my own, that made a big difference to games. Being in the campaign context, even if it's just in that very loose way that I've described of linking battles previously, I think variable deployment, variable enemy forces, maybe even variable of your own forces. So possibly even having a card there where it could actually be not an enemy that's coming in, but a small reinforcement for your own. I think really key to me for solo games is variable movement. I think it makes a huge difference because it adds that unpredictability. Are they going to get to the hedge and get into cover or not? You don't quite know whether they'll get there before somebody opens up on them or whatever, that sort of thing. And I think the other one, perhaps not so important, but has been quite fun to do, is the commanders, the enemy leaders' attitude or characteristics as well can really add in. But it's really not that much work to get there.
It's interesting. I was scrolling back through some of the old TooFatLardies specials because I think previously, we've got articles in there on solo gaming. And the first one I came across was in 2005 by Max Maxwell. You remember Max? And he wrote about IBSM solo gaming. And one of the things he put in that article was how you could make leaders appear to be have different characteristics. So he said, for instance, I've just got it up here. You can have cautious commanders that will avoid firing at long range and will not counterattack, or you have cowardly commanders that will order a retreat if the enemy move into close range. And 4 or 5 different characteristics, which I thought was a lovely little touch, actually. And I think that, again, just to reflect on the specials while we're on that, is that I thought there was a lot more content on solo gaming in the specials than there is, but that's because lots of scenarios have at the end something about having an adaptation for solo gaming, which is why I think that's really prevalent in my thinking. But nice ideas about having characteristics for commanders, really nice way of reflecting the person on the other side of the table. Rich?
Can I ask a very specific question here? Because one of the reasons that solo gaming came up, as we were discussing earlier in the show, was that we went to Pat McCon and did a question and answer question there. And one of the guys there, excuse me, who we were talking to, whose name unfortunately escapes me at the moment, asked a very, very specific question, which was, how could I, in a solo game, avoid the fact that I know what my opponent's intention is? If we're setting up a scenario where my job is to capture the bridge, normally your opponent's job is to capture the bridge, but it may be that there could be some way we could build it into our games where we weren't sure what the opponent's objective was. And I thought, blimey, that's a big ask. That's really difficult. But I'm just wondering about the card idea that Charlie's got, whether you could potentially, when you set up a table, have 3 key objectives on it. Yes, you've got the bridge, but you've also got the church, and you've also got the inn. And at the outset of the game, your objective is to capture the bridge. But maybe you don't discover what your opponent's objective is until you turn a card on turn 2 or 3, or when the first lot of reinforcements come on. I don't know. Anybody got any thoughts on that? It's that knowing the enemy's intent that potentially always undermines a solo game, because you always know what's going on.
Well, I think one of the Charlie mentioned a really, really great book earlier when he first started, which is Program War Game Scenarios by Charles Grant, which is right back in the 80s, about 83, 84, by War Games Research Group. And that was one of the earliest ways of having kind of decision trees, different decision trees for your solo opponent. so to speak. So this would be in Charlie's thrill seeker mode. You would have a decision tree.
My God.
You would have a decision tree for your solo opponent, but you might not just have the one decision tree. So you could create, say, 3 decision trees. And if you broke that down, each tree into 3 bits, you could create those 3 cards. And essentially, you could either, in an envelope, you could put those 3 cards for one decision tree. You wouldn't know which decision tree you're dealing with, and they would come out, and you would take them one after another. Or you could jumble them up. So I think there's different ways in which you could have different approaches by the enemy forces in a way which is revealed that you've got an idea, but you're not quite sure what they're going to do. Rich?
Decision tree. I don't know what you're talking about. Can you explain how that would actually work in a real situation?
I can. Yes, why not? So you're creating the approach of the enemy force. So there may be 3 things that the enemy force might do. Say you've just got an encounter, you've got a settlement in the middle of the board or the table, and you've got 2 or 3 different approaches. So the first decision for the enemy forces would be, well, what's their objective? Is it to press on to take the settlement? Is it to avoid you advancing past the settlement and exiting the board? Or maybe it's to try and envelop you and pass by you. So there would be, in that example, there would be 3 different options for the enemy forces. Now, you as the thrill seeker, in your thrill seeker mode, you wouldn't know what the enemy's going to do. So the first set of moves, you've perhaps got an envelope, you've jumbled up the cards beforehand, you're going to have pick the envelope, and it will have information relating to what you see the enemy forces doing. Now, you won't know whether they're advancing to hold or advancing to take that settlement or advancing around the flanks. You will react to that. So if you like, that's the start of the trunk of the tree. And then when you get the next envelope, there'll be perhaps more cards which have been available to be picked. A bit like Cluedo. You know, you pick the cards and you put them in the envelope. You probably have 2 or 3 envelopes. So the next bit of the tree is the branches coming out, and there'll be more options there. And then the final.
I'm not grasping it. So my imaginary troops, because I don't exist as your opponent, come on the table, and you don't know what they're doing. So you then move them what? Across the table? What do you do?
In your card that you've drawn for the enemy,
right,
you will have set out, you know, what their move is, or similar to what their move is. Are they advancing to take the settlement? Are they advancing to hold the position before the settlement? Are they advancing towards the flanks? Or are they just holding that?
At what point do you know that, and then how do you know that immediately when they come on the table, or?
No, you wouldn't know that immediately. But how are you controlling the movement of the enemy forces in your thrill seeker mode? There must be some way that you have as a mechanism for controlling any move of those enemy forces.
There is, but in the thrill seeker mode, I'm very much taking the role of one side, and my feeling is that in reality, that commander who, you know, I'm in charge of that side, and I know that I need to capture the bridge. I wouldn't say I don't care what the enemy are doing, but I almost always don't know what the enemy's objective is. If I am that commander, I don't know what their objective is, unless I've got some very good intelligence on what their objective is, unless it is, particularly if it's anything different to me capturing that bridge. So I take the view that those troops will move based on their own leaders' kind of attitude and outlook on things. So if he's an aggressive leader or a bold leader, he's going to start advancing irrespective of whether their whole force is there, perhaps.
But doesn't that give the game away? If you know that your opponent is bold, you know that they're just going to keep coming on.
Well, there is that. Yes, there is that, and I have tinkered around with aspects there where you don't know that, and you just roll that each turn. But it was a bit more fiddly, and the other thing with it was you tended to get, you know, he might be really bold one minute and then very cautious another. But you could work away with that. But that is, yeah, absolutely, you're absolutely right. Right.
So let's try and get some ideas happening here. So we're going to start off with Charlie's idea of cards. How your programmed enemy has got a core force, then the cards, and then we'll get into a bit of your topiary, Sydney, with decision-making, arboretums and whatever. So how about this? So the force that I'm up against, the program force I'm up against, is maybe 3 units in sharp practice of line troops under a sergeant. And they're the troops who just encountered me as I start on my mission. Then the first card that comes out determines the leader of the program force and what his mission is of the 3 objectives that we've got on the table.
So that's probably your option, isn't it?
Yeah.
You've got an option to what the objective is.
And the supports that he's coming on with. So that's their initial objective point, right?
Yeah.
And then, as the game continues, every time that the blank card comes out and Charlie's system allows for reinforcements to come on, or, you know, whatever, maybe a messenger comes on and we roll a dice and see if those objective points have changed. Now, there's 3 objective points. I wouldn't suggest that it was evenly balanced. I'd suggest that maybe 1, 2, 3 or 4, the objective remains the same, but on a 5, it changes to one of the other ones, and on a 6 to one of the other ones. So you never know, their objectives might change during the battle. Sid, you look like a thought has occurred to you.
Well, it has, because what you might want to do is you've got your objective, but what you might want to add on to that your orders. So you know what your objective is,
yeah.
But another level you can add on to that is what are the force's orders? How do they actually achieve the objective?
Well, whose orders? Your force or the programmed force?
The programmed force.
But then you will know what their objective is.
Well, you won't if you have different possibilities
right.
for their objectives and different possibilities for their orders. You could have 1 to 6 of each.
Oh, right. So the objective could become the inn, but maybe one objective would be to burn down the inn if the British have already got in there, or maybe it would be to rescue the innkeeper's daughter if the British were looking like getting in there, or maybe it would be to get in there and rescue the case of wine for the general.
Exactly. And then what you might want to build on top of that is what the opponent's responses are to what you're doing.
No, that's taking it too far. Surely. Surely. How would that work?
Is it overcomplicating something that really doesn't need to be overcomplicated? Does it really matter what the opponent's intention is? If I'm gaming against you on the tabletop, I don't give a stuff about your intention necessarily. It's all about me getting what I want.
Well,
that's what your wife told me it was all about with you, mate.
But aren't you really doing that when you're creating characters for the opponent's leaders? Because their responses as a bold leader will probably be press harder. Their responses as a cautious leader might be to hold or even withdraw slightly.
Can't you just let their intentions emerge? So, for instance, they don't have to have like a grand vision at the beginning. It's just like, what do they do next? What do they do next? Do they rescue the woman or do they shoot her? You know, what they've got 2 options. In every situation, there are at least 2 options, and it's what does your opponent do in each of those, isn't it?
Well, I totally agree. All we're doing is thinking about possibilities that you might have in the game. But let's ask Charlie, because he is the expert and not me. So, Charlie, how do you do? I mean, is it programmed how your virtual enemy responds, or is it more like, as Nick would say, does it just evolve from what's happening on the tabletop?
A bit of both, in truth, often depending on my mood at the time, which is another beauty of solo gaming.
Yeah.
Not restricted to it, but I have done a very simple, what you're describing, Sydney, a very simple thing. How will they react to this? 1 or 2, they're going to do this. 3 or 4, they're going to do the kind of average thing, and 5 or 6, they're going to get really punchy or whatever, something along those lines. So a bit of both, but in truth, latterly for me, it's often been more driven off. I've got those characters in the leaders. It's more driven off that, and I haven't been that adventurous with this idea of having an unknown objective for the opposing force. It's tended to be, I need to rescue the lady, and they've got her. Therefore, they will try to stop me doing that. But it's a really interesting way of taking it up a notch, I think.
I think the key thing is it has to be simple. There's no point in layering on, yards and yards of frills when all you really want to do is, when that reinforcement comes on, does a messenger come and say, slight change of plan? Because, I mean, all the objectives are going to be pretty much in the central. If you imagine a 6x4 table, you've got the peripheries, which is the foot all the way around the outside. And then you've got the central area of 4x2, which is where the key action, is probably going to be taking part in the game. So all of our 3 key objectives or potential objectives for the enemy should be in that central area of the table. And it's not going to result in them being on the complete left-hand side of the table and swinging over to the complete right. It's just going to be, oh, look, there's the inn. And suddenly the word is, the inn is now the important thing, because somebody's realised the general supply of Grand Cru is in there. And that means they not only do they have to go in and get the Grand Cru, they have to get a wagon to take it away on, because there's quite an amount of it, which makes it different to rescuing the barmaid or the countess or whatever. And again, it might be that they never look at that because they're more interested in going to the church, because they don't want the British to steal the silver. So I just think that there are ways, based on your core ideas of these cards and based on Sydney's topiary plans, there are ways of combining the two, but keeping it really, really simple. So the intent fluctuates and varies, but doesn't change utterly. People are not, rushing around the table in a chaotic manner, but the intent can change. Nicholas?
And I guess also you can have, if you've got an objective, if you know they're going to go to the church and there's some kind of objective in the church, it could be the stash of Grand Cru, or it could be, the fallen woman who needs rescuing, or it could be a cart full of oranges. Whatever it is, you can have that. You don't necessarily know what that is until the moment when they get there, which might mean that therefore what they find could be attractive to you. You think, oh, I'll go and rescue that woman or steal the Grand Cru. Or you might say, well, we'll let them keep that because our focus is elsewhere. Charlie?
Yeah, and I think that's, you raise an interesting point there, because I think one of the scenarios in the Shark Practice book, isn't there, you're trying to rescue or recapture somebody and you don't know which building they're in one of several different buildings. That's another great little twist.
That's the
either
spy
side would know.
Or not there at all.
Yeah, that's the big sort of spy, get the spy out scenario, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, that's
interesting stuff.
Yeah, that is interesting stuff. And I think, and one of the reasons that that this is so much of interest to me is not just that we were asked it in the PatMacon conversations, but because I'm going to be doing some solo gaming myself next week, testing out some of the more obscure factions for infamy. I'm going to be working on the rebellious slaves and gladiators, just to try out some games. And I wanted to do something in there to see if we could introduce something in there that could be the basis of that. So I think probably that's given me some real ideas to pick up and run with. Anything else anybody wants to...
Yeah, I can add to that, because of course I knew we were going to be having this conversation, so I put the question out on Twitter about, tell us guys, how do you do your solo gaming? And we've got some interesting replies to that. The prime one that came back from that is, if you're aware of, certainly his handle on Twitter is Storm of Steel, I think. He has a series of videos that he's doing that are him playing IABSM, and of course at the moment he's playing those solo, and his most recent posting, I think it's his most recent posting, is of him playing a game in Stalingrad, playing it solo. And what he's doing there, having watched the film, is he's using a deck of cards for the opponent's units, including in there some dummies, and he's dealing those out into locations on the battlefield. And then as he comes across that position, he's revealing the card. I guess there's nothing revolutionary about that, but it doesn't need to be revolutionary in that it works. What he did, which I thought was a step above that basic level, was that he was making sure that the units were separated so that you could only have units in feasible locations. So, for instance, a tank unit wouldn't appear in the middle of a church. It would be in the road or somewhere else. So it'd have to have some kind of condition for that. That was quite good. And the other responses we got were quite interesting. I'll just read you through some of them now if I can find them. So we've got, let me see. So a mix of people who don't play it. So, people that say they don't like it or don't like to play solo, but people like to play out a narrative. Goat Major says, I don't try to suppress any unnatural bias that I might have when I play solo. I like to play out a narrative. He says, I play the game and use random results, but I'm not averse to bending them a bit to help the story in my head. If I really want the Grenadiers to charge, then they do. At the end of the day, you're pleasuring yourself, aren't you? Which means that actually what happens is entirely up to you, and you can do the way you want to. People talk about other rule sets having particular aspects that they might like. So the Men Who Would Be Kings, for instance, has got something in there that people can play with. And Mythic Role Player has a standalone system for solo play, which people have applied. Legendary Noise Machine says he tried to apply that to his campaigns, but not yet on the table. Some people, of course, just give the enemy a 50-50 chance. So if they have two actions available to them, James Goodroll says that it's a 50-50 chance. Okay, I'll roll a dice, and then I can weight that if I need to. Not complicated, is it? Again, it doesn't need to be overly complicated. It just works. And people say, James says, I like to set what conditions will cause each side to withdraw from the table beforehand, which is something perhaps we've not discussed. Sometimes I'll come up with a few for the enemy and then draw one halfway through the action, making them different helps with the fog. Charlie, that's a question I've got for you. How do you know when you've won a solo game? How do you know when to stop?
Well, for me, with sharp practice, it's either you've achieved the objective or it's a force morale clock has run down on one or the other, usually my own force. So that type of game, you have quite a clear cut finish to. But I have done games where I haven't been using force morale for whatever reason or different sets of rules, and I've let the game run and run. But yeah, I think you get into that place where you're feeling, this is just a slog to the last man, which unless it's a last stand type scenario isn't particularly plausible. But yeah, so that's where I find the force morale thing works really well. It's either that or the objective is achieved.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing about force morale. The results are variable, which means you don't know how quickly your force morale is going to descend to the bottom, and that was a key design intent. You're not sure the loss of that officer could pass almost unnoticed, or it could really affect the force. I think what I'm hearing from all of this is evolution beats revolution every time. We don't need massive tomes of very clever, newly created rules. All you need to really do is to create some tweaks to a normal two-player game that allows a solo game to be enhanced somewhat and have a life of its own.
I think we're lucky in that the mechanisms in TooFatLardies rules generally work really well for solo play. Card mechanisms, dice mechanisms, water tanker sequential activation mechanisms really work. I've played water tanker solo a lot, and the activation system means that you can go from one tank to the next, to the next, to the next, and you can just put yourself in each turret and see which version of you is going to come out on top. And people using social media as well. So David Hiscox, in reply to my post on Twitter, he said, personally, I've largely just played sharp practice solo as presented in the rules, as the card mechanic, along with some common sense and a sense of fair play, works well enough for me. And for any controversial decisions, I've asked the Twitter community to vote on what happens. And I guess if you've got if you're not playing in a specific 2-hour window, it's okay to do that, isn't it? You can put a controversial decision out to the Twitter community or out to Facebook or whatever it is you may be, and let them make the next move for you.
I like that reply a lot. I thought that was a really fun way that David had mentioned having a decision which you can't control, because you get people like us voting on Twitter. which would be quite entertaining. So, Richard, maybe we can all vote as your opponent.
Certainly be entertaining if Sid's doing the voting.
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the things I was thinking about is how do we, in this age of lockdown, try and turn our solo games into something that involve other people, if that isn't, you know, an oxymoron. I was wondering, you know, was there a situation whereby I send you a picture of the table and maybe tell you what those 3 objectives are? You choose your force based on the points value. You choose your support options, again, based on the points value that we're talking about. And you then decide on the objective. I then set my force up, choose my force, and then I open the email from you to discover what your intent is. Now, that in a way doesn't appeal to me as much as the alternative that we've been talking about here, which was Charlie's card index system, and added to that is the objective still the same, or can it change slightly? And I think that's the one I'm going to be playing out and trying over the next week or 2 when I'm doing my play testing here.
That is solo, isn't it? That is solo in as much as Charlie is doing it. If you're involving other people, if you're even asking them to make decisions or to suggest on the next move, it ceases to be solo, I guess, if you're going to be pedantic.
It does, but it's in these times where we're locked down, you know, could I run a game here and have you on the end of, I don't know, Zoom or something like that, where I'm showing you pictures of the table with my phone and asking you what decisions to make? I think that's...
I'm seeing that quite a lot. I'm seeing on social media feeds people are doing a lot of that. People are playing, guys are playing, for instance, some guys playing a game of What a Tanker. They've been playing it for about 3 weeks on Twitter. You know, where the guy got a photo of the table, then a photo of the dice that you've got, and then you reply and tell me what you want to do. And he's playing out over a long period of time. But people are playing games over Zoom. People are duplicating tables or having other players look in from the outside and tell them what to do. You know, wargaming it's like war. It will find a way. It's like water. It will find a way through, and it will find a way to persevere.
Well, I think that's a suitable end for our segment with talking about how to set up those solo games. So, Charlie, look, thanks so much for coming down from the borders and joining us virtually in the southeast. What have you got next on the painting table before we drift off, Charlie? What are you doing at the moment in addition to gaming?
Farming mainly, but there's lots on the painting table, but it's been there for several months, in truth. The ceiling collapsed above my little gaming and hobby area not too long ago, so it's in stasis, unfortunately. Okay.
Somebody put in soil in the loft, are they, from the tunnel they're building to get out of self-isolation?
I think it could be. But yeah, it's mostly infamy related stuff, Imperial Romans and Britons and Germans.
Oh, that sounds fantastic.
Sorry, I'm going to ask Charlie's been Discording with us as well, Charlie, of course. How have you found that, just while we've got you on?
I have loved it. I've found it to be a completely new gaming experience. I've played 3 Kriegspiels this year, one of which was at Southampton, a face-to-face, as it were, but 2 on Discord now, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. Just that ability to, if you like, savor the game, think about it, mull it over, and then these intense flurries of activity when stuff kicks off. I've really, really enjoyed that, and it's fitted in really well with working life, family life as well in the sort of current circumstances.
Well, that's fantastic. So all we have now to do is to say, ladies and gentlemen, give a big hand for Charlie. And hopefully some interesting ideas in there that we can all try out. So Richard, can you report back to us on how that goes on our solo slave revolts? I think we're all interested to know whether your villa gets burnt in the Tuscan hills.
Yeah, I might take some photos of me playing with myself and put it on social media.
I think we'll all look forward to that. So now let's tread a path through the Lard Mansion, which we haven't been on for a while. And let's wander up to the Lard Island Library. Now, I know we're all locked down, and that's created some time for reading and research. But what I'm really interested to know, guys, is what books you've purchased while on coronavirus lockdown, and what was it about them that appealed to you? I'm going to start first with Nicholas.
Are you indeed? Okay, I've got a number of books actually, and it has been a good time for reconnecting to books and to be tempted into buying new books. It's also that time of year when societies, I don't know if you're involved in any societies that send out annual publications, etc. It's that time of year when they tend to come available. I've got a few books I want to run through. First book that I've actually purchased and got drawn into was a book called The Path of the 50th. Now, this is by Clay, and I'm not quite sure Clay's full. Major Ewart W. Clay, MBE. It's one of those divisional histories that was written in 1950, and is a lovely old, bound book that's got fold-out maps, etc. And it was a book that came into my awareness through something else that I'd read, and then when I Googled it, it was one of those things that was quite rare and quite difficult to grab hold of. So I had to make an investment to actually bring this to my library. And it was quite a meaty investment, but I've done that on the basis that it is my birthday coming up. It was a lot of money, but it's one of those books that you have to have in the collection, really. Now, I have to say, I spent £79 on this book. I don't think it's quite worth 79 quid, but it's probably worth 50 quid. So I'm pleased with that one. Really, really good read and working my way through that. I want to go on to other books. I said about societies that release things at this time of year. I'm a member of the 1805 Club. Did you know that? The 1805 Club is interested in all things Nelsonian and the Georgian Navy, etc. They produce each year something called the Trafalgar Chronicle, which, as you'll see, is about half an inch thick. It's an A5 format book, 208 pages, filled with articles and observations on memorabilia around Nelsonian naval stuff, and also bizarre histories of people you've never heard of. But you join the 1805 Club for 30 quid, and you get one of these books every year. And you also get something called the Kedge Anchor. Now, they're not paying me to advertise this, by the way. I just thought it would be the kind of things at the moment people are looking for engagement, that these societies are really great. They produce something called the Kedge Anchor, which is a very thin magazine which comes out, I think, probably twice a year, again, which has got, an article on the Battle of the Nile, for instance, all kinds of bizarre histories of individual chapels that are dedicated to ship's captains. It's fairly dry, but the sort of thing that's nice to have through your doorstep when you're sitting in isolation, you can't get anything else. And the third one for me, it comes from another society that I'm involved with, and I know Richard is a member of this as well. This is called the Arnhem Fellowship. The Arnhem Fellowship is I don't know really what it is, but it's kind of something that's involved in the honouring and remembering what went on at Arnhem. And one of the books that they produce is called an Arnhem Diary. Every now and then they will produce and release little snippets of previously unpublished or rare material. And this one is around a guy who was in the 10th Parachute Battalion, and it's just a 30-page A4 book of this guy's own particular diary and cross-reference to the battalion diary for the 10th Battalion Parachute Regiment. So that's really worth it. So these small societies that produce these books are super.
That's fantastic. I mean, all of those look really, really good reads. Rich, what have you been picking up in lockdown?
A couple of fairly obvious ones, I suppose. Livy's Histories of Rome, his extensive volumes there. I'm particularly starting to look at the Punic War. Roman Conquests on the Danube Frontier, which I've got here by Michael Schmitz, which I'm very interested in because I'm very keen. I've just bought a Dacian army, so I'm really keen to get cracking with that and want some good background information. There's not a lot of original source material on the Dacians, so it's there's a lot of archaeology that I'm going to look at, and lots of other people's opinions, which is never a great starting point. I always prefer to look at the historians of the time and accept the fact and factor in that they've got their own agendas and biases, but nevertheless, there we go, they can't have everything. Couple of other interesting ones. I've got volume 2 of the combat history of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Gotz von Berlichingen. And the reason I bought that is I've already got volume 1, and this was another crazy price book. But I'm very interested in the fighting around Metz in 1944. And these guys were heavily involved in that, pretty much the backbone of the German defence in places. So I got that one, which hopefully is going to be interesting. And finally, one of the books that's given me the most joy has actually been an audio book. We were having a chat on Twitter about bush wars in Africa, and I thought, you know what, I haven't read Mike Hoare's Congo Mercenary, Mad Mike Hoare, I haven't read it in years. And I went to buy it, and I couldn't believe that it's out of print, because it was such a classic book. But I had a look on Audible, and they've got it on there, and it is read by Colonel Hoare himself. And it is fantastic. His dry wit and sense of humour comes through, and it's a really, really great read. And I've got that because I'm keen to do a African mercenary Kriegspiel game. Well, one night somebody will get a knock on the door saying, "Are you interested in exciting work in Africa? And here's an expensive cheque for £5,000. Come and have a meeting at the London Sheraton, Park Lane Sheraton, and your mission will be revealed." And then they will have to go about recruiting their own team of mercenaries, so mercenary leaders. So I won't be picking who's in their Discord team. They'll be doing the recruitment. I'll just be managing it. And I just think that could be a really fun game. I've got quite a lot of maps of Africa in my collection, not on the mattress. But yeah, I thought that'd be quite fun.
I know you'll be concerned, but for many listeners, I imagine there are shades of the wild geese already in their minds.
Absolutely right. Well, funnily enough, I bought that video on Netflix or whatever it was the other night and watched it over several bottles of wine and just really enjoyed soaking up the atmosphere. And there were a lot of pointers in there that are reminding me just about the 1970s. That you think, blimey, I'd forgotten it was like that. And that will be good for setting the scene. Good fun, yeah.
So if you're a big fat African dictator and you've got nothing to do on lockdown, they could come and join in your game, Rich.
Yeah, that's very true. That's right. If you are a disposed despot, why not join in on our Discord game?
So is that your book's done, Rich?
That's my book's done, mate, yeah.
Well, I've got one, and a bit like you, Nick, it was an expensive book. It's not a huge book, but it was an expensive book. It was about £45, and it's called The King's Army, and it's Warfare, Soldiers and Society During the Wars of Religion in France, 1562 to 1576, by James Wood. Now, what I like about this book is it's beautifully produced, but it really has a great way of looking at warfare, because it's a bit like a detective novel. It starts out by saying, how comes there are so many different wars of religion? Why didn't the French crown just get rid of these irritating Protestant Huguenots? Why did it lose? It's the wealthiest country in Europe. Why was it such a pain? Why did they have 50 years of war, which really delayed French dominance of Europe? And Professor Wood goes on and demonstrates this. I'm only halfway through, but it's a cracking read in really clear, very military specific reasons why the French Royal Army struggled to defeat the Huguenots. And it doesn't really matter to me sometimes what period it is, where it's a great thread of argument and analysis, whether it's from ancient times right up to modern times. I just love those sort of books where the author takes you on a well-researched, well-evidenced journey and has a clear argument in mind. It gets really great reviews online everywhere, so I have no hesitation in recommending it.
Has somebody else read it?
Pardon?
Has somebody else read it?
only people like me, which is probably not a recommendation you want to hear. But it's
you and Professor Wood.
a beautifully written book, and I really, really am enjoying that. And it's not the sort of book that you'd normally read. It's the sort of book that you'd buy because you think, well, you know, it's one of the classics. But is it really the sort of book that you're going to read assiduously? And it isn't. But it's where you have 3 or 4 hours to sit down because you can't go out and you're sitting in the garden and you just get immersed in it. And as you said, Richard, Nick, that's one of the real strengths of looking at the positives for the situation we've got, which is we've got quite a lot of time on our hands and we can't go swimming or cycling or shopping in blue water or whatever it is.
Right.
Thank God for that. I can't imagine doing it, any of those three things. They'd be horrendous.
Well, then let's all hope that those books turn out to be as good as we hope. And I think on that note, halfway through our lockdown books and our lockdown reading, we can draw the episode to a close. So my thanks again, heartfelt to Charlie for joining us, and thank all of you for listening. Keep well. Please do keep in touch through all of the forums and social media. We know lockdown can be a real pain sometimes, and it's great that we're not completely excluded and we can keep up to date with the extended Lard community all around the world. So we're going to be back soon with more here and on Lard TV. So on that note, I think it's up to us to say good night, and thank you to Nick and Richard.
Good night.
Cheerio.
And we'll let Roger Barraclough and his band, who are still available and social distanced, to play us out.
In tonight's show, Sydney Roundwood was joined by Nick Skinner and Richard Clark, with music by Roger Barraclough and his band.